Welcome. I'm James Snapp Jr., a Christian minister. Today, in the next hour, we are going to explore some evidence that involves a major issue in the field of New Testament textual criticism, the ending of the Gospel of Mark. In an earlier lecture, we looked into some evidence for Mark 16:9 through 20, provided by early church writings. We found that over 30 writers, each one working before the fall of the Roman Empire, support the inclusion of these verses. In part 1 of today's lecture, we'll examine evidence from Codex Vaticanus, Codex L, and Old Latin Codex Bobbiensis. In part 2, we'll examine the evidence from Codex Sinaiticus. In part 3, we'll consider the testimony that comes from Eusebius and Jerome. And in part 4, we'll consider some other pieces of evidence, including the Sinaitic Syriac. You might have read in the NIV or in the ESV or in some other version a heading or footnote at Mark chapter 16, verse 8, to the effect that some early manuscripts, or the earliest manuscripts, do not contain verses 9 through 20. Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus are the two Greek manuscripts to which those notes refer. In these two Greek manuscripts, Mark ends at the end of verse 8, followed by the closing title of the book. The other Greek manuscripts, Codex A, Codex C, Codex D, over 1,500 Greek manuscripts, include verses 9 through 20, unless they are damaged. You might wonder, why would anyone prefer a reading that is found in such a small minority of Greek manuscripts? You might think that it's because Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are, as the footnotes say, the earliest manuscripts of Mark chapter 16, and it makes sense to adopt the reading with the earliest support. But that's not it. Vaticanus and Sinaiticus were made in the 300s. In the 100s, Tatian used Mark 16:9 through 20, and Irenaeus quoted Mark 16:19, stating that he was quoting from the Gospel of Mark. So the abrupt ending at verse 8 is not the reading with the earliest support, nor is it the reading with the most widespread support. As shown in the earlier lecture, over 30 early writers from all over the Roman Empire used Mark 16:9 through 20. Well, you might think it's because of the internal evidence. The style and vocabulary of Mark 16:9 through 20 is different from the rest of the book. But even if it's granted that the style of this passage favors the idea that it was added to the main part of the book, that would only imply that more than one person contributed to this book. Consider Proverbs chapter 30. The inspired person who told us not to add to the words of God was not the main author of the book of Proverbs. The author of Proverbs chapter 30, verse 6, was Agur, a secondary contributor to the text. Should we remove what Agur wrote on the grounds that he was not the primary author of the book of Proverbs? If not, then it follows that even if internal evidence shows that a passage is likely to be from a secondary contributor, that does not decide the question of whether or not the passage was originally in the text before its production stage was completed. So, why would a commentator adopt the reading shared by Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus when there's all this other evidence to the contrary? Based on what those commentators have written, I feel confident when I say that a lot of commentators have adopted the abrupt ending of Mark as the result of sloppy and superficial research. It's clear to me that a lot of commentators have simply picked up Bruce Metzger's textual commentary on the Greek New Testament and his text of the New Testament, which both say pretty much the same thing about Mark 16:9 through 20. And those commentators have paraphrased what Dr. Metzger wrote, without engaging in a careful consideration of the evidence. Today we're going to do what those commentators did not do. This is a replica of the last page of Mark in Codex Vaticanus, also called Codex B. Usually, when the copyist of Codex Vaticanus finished a book, he wrote the subscription, the closing title of the book, below the text, and he began the next book in the very next column. That is what he did throughout the New Testament, except here. On this page, after the text of Mark ends at the end of verse 8, he added the closing title. Then, he left the next column completely blank. Before I say more about this, I must address something that was recently stated by Dr. Daniel Wallace, a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, regarding 3 other blank spaces in Codex Vaticanus. Those 3 other blank spaces occur at the end of the book of 2nd Esdras, at the end of the book of Tobit, and at the end of the book of Bel and the Dragon, which in Codex Vaticanus is formatted as the last part of the book of Daniel. Dr. Wallace said, "The reasons for the gaps are anything but clear." In real life, it is plain to see that the blank space after 2nd Esdras occurs because the format of the text changes. In 2nd Esdras, the text is formatted in 3 columns per page. But the next book, the book of Psalms, is formatted in 2 columns per page. So the book of Psalms had to begin at the beginning of a page. Unless the text of 2nd Esdras had happened to conclude in the last column of the page, it would be inevitable that some blank space would be left over between the end of the text on the last 3-column page and the beginning of the text on the first 2-column page. The blank space at the end of the book of Tobit exists because that's where one copyist assigned portion of the text ended. The text in the next book, Hosea, is written by a different copyist. All that happened here is that the copyist who copied the text of the book of Tobit had nothing left to write after completing his assigned portion of text. So he left the remainder of the page blank, including another whole 2-sided page that's been snipped out. Another copyist produced the next section of text, and the 2 parts were then sewn together later in the production of the Codex. The blank space after the end of the story of Bel and the Dragon occurs because it too is leftover space. In Codex Vaticanus, the books are arranged in a different order than what we're used to. In Codex Vaticanus, the book of Daniel, in its expanded form, is the last Old Testament book. Matthew, as the first book of the New Testament, begins, of course, on a new page. The reasons for those blank spaces are clear. They are crystal clear. The factors that caused those blank spaces are not operating at the end of the Gospel of Mark. There is no format change. There's no change in the genre of the books. There's no change in the handwriting. The same copyist who copied the text of Mark on one side of the page copied the text of Luke on the other side. The copyist deliberately left this column blank. The blank space after the end of verse 8 in Codex Vaticanus is not quite large enough to contain verses 9 through 20 if they are written in the copyist's normal handwriting. But it's a reasonably close estimate, only 4 lines too short. If a copyist wrote his letters closer together, as shown in this reconstruction, he could include verses 9 through 20 in the blank space. The closing title would thus be placed in the lower margin, but in Codex Vaticanus, the closing title of the Gospel of Luke also enters the lower margin, and so does the closing title of Philippians, so that was obviously not considered objectionable. Notice that in this reconstruction, the Alexandrian reading in verse 18 is included, and only the basic sacred names and the Greek word for "and" are contracted. The logical conclusion to draw from this is that the copyist was using an exemplar in which the text ended at verse 8, but he was aware of the remaining 12 verses and attempted to leave space for them in the event that someone else might want to add them from a different exemplar. So, although a commentator has said the gap in B at the end of Mark cannot be said to leave space for the longer ending, such claims simply defy the evidence. Someone might ask, how do we know the copyist wasn't trying to leave space for the shorter ending? To answer that question plainly, we first have to make the question plain. So let's introduce the shorter ending by looking at a page from another manuscript, Codex L. The term shorter ending does not refer to the abrupt ending at the end of verse 8. The shorter ending is an alternative ending. 5 Greek manuscripts, including Codex L, have this alternative ending between verse 8 and verse 9. In another Greek manuscript, 274, it is in the margin. In Codex L, it is introduced with a short note that says, "In some there is also this." Then it has the shorter ending. "And they reported to Peter and to those with him all that had been told to them. And after this, Jesus sent out through them, from east to west, the sacred and imperishable gospel of eternal salvation. Then there's also another note that says, there is also this appearing after Ephobountogar being the last words of verse 8, and after that, verse 9 begins. In the Old Latin Codex Bobbiensis, which was made in around the year 430, the text of Mark 16 has been tampered with. The names of the women in verse 1 have been removed. After verse 3, a short episode describing the resurrection of Christ has been added, picturing Christ ascending to heaven at the same time that he rises from the dead. In verse 8, there is no statement that the women said nothing to anyone. And, as shown here, all that comes after verse 8 is the shorter ending, written in a rather incompetent way. The shorter ending is also attested in Egyptian versions, in Sahidic, in Baharic, and also in Ethiopic. Every time it appears after Mark 16:8, it's followed by the usual ending, except in Codex Bobbiensis. The notes that sometimes accompany these two endings show that somewhere in Egypt, copyists were aware of some copies that had verses 9 through 20 after verse 8, and some copies that had the alternative ending, the shorter ending, after verse 8. In one copy, a fragment known as Codex 083, the notes and the arrangement of the text indicate that a copyist, somewhere along the line, had at least one copy that ended at verse 8, another copyist that ended with the shorter ending, and another copy that ended with verses 9 through 20. So, again, how do we know the copyist of Vaticanus was not trying to leave space for the shorter ending? Well, we don't know that absolutely. We can't read the mind of the copyist, obviously. But the shorter ending is clearly a localized reading found in copies from Egypt. There's no evidence that it was known anywhere else for hundreds of years. Later in this lecture, we will see evidence that even though the text of Vaticanus is Egyptian, the codex itself was almost certainly made in Caesarea, not in Egypt. And we will also see evidence that in Caesarea, in the early 300s, the shorter ending was not known. And there's something else to consider. If the copyist's goal had been to leave enough blank space for the shorter ending, he would have had no reason to leave the third column blank. As you can see in this expanded replica, when the shorter ending is added after the end of verse 8, in the same writing style normally used by the copyist, it fits snugly into the second column when placed immediately after the end of chapter 16, verse 8. So he would have had no reason not to begin the text of Luke at the top of the third column. Again, we see the subscription in the lower margin, but again, that's the same thing that we see in Luke and Philippians. Theoretically, it's possible that the copyist possessed one exemplar with the shorter ending and another copy with verses 9 through 20, and he perceived that only one of them should be included, but he was not sure which one. So he left room so that either one could be included, but not both. Verses 9 through 20 could be included on this page by using compressed lettering, as we have seen, or the shorter ending could be included, as shown in this reconstruction, by beginning on the line after the end of verse 8 and using stretched out lettering so that the copyist would have just a few letters left over to put up at the top of the third column. That is unlikely, though, for reasons that will be presented later in the lecture. But even at this point, two things should be clear. First, the blank space in Codex B after verse 8 was placed there deliberately. And second, the blank space implies that the copyist of Codex B was aware of a form of the text in which there was additional material after verse 8. Bruce Metzger, in his book, A Textual Commentary on the Greek New Testament, somehow failed to mention this blank space, even though he had read Hort's 1881 Notes on Select Readings, in which Hort described it and affirmed that it implies that the copyist was aware of additional material. Because Metzger did not mention it, most of the commentators who have parroted Metzger have not mentioned it either. It is not mentioned in any edition of the United Bible Society's Greek New Testament, but it definitely should be mentioned. Whenever a commentator cites Codex Vaticanus as a witness against Mark 16:9-20, without mentioning that the copyist, by leaving this blank space, has provided evidence of his own awareness of a longer form of the text, that commentator is misleading his readers by leaving out an important piece of the evidence. More will be said about Codex B after we have described Codex Sinaiticus.